Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here today. Many of you may be wondering what a technology company like IBM is doing in the field of healthcare. And so I'm going to take you through this journey that we've been on as a technology company over the last few years to look at how can we apply algorithms and techniques for analyzing big data to the field of medicine. So in 2014, we launched our Watson Health business unit. And our focus is very much around accelerating the progress of medicine as it relates to the individual, from all aspects of wellness, from an individual who's not yet a patient, focused on wellness programs, all the way through to identification and treatment. Now, if you step back 5 years ago, Watson was known as the Jeopardy computer. Watson was a system that we built to play a game show, Jeopardy. And if you go back over 10 years ago, we were building systems to play the game of chess, our Deep Blue computer. So the technologies and techniques that you develop in playing games like chess or Jeopardy actually enable you to advance the state of the art of computer science. And that's where our scientists come in. Our researchers are focused on developing new algorithms using techniques like machine learning and deep learning to advance the state of the art of the computer science that now enable us to build the analytics to interpret health. So with Watson Health, we're very much focused on the individual. Now, Michael and David had a similar graphic like this one, really focused on the individual. And if you look at the actual data that each one of us in this room will generate during the course of our lifetime, each one of us will generate about the equivalent of 300 million books worth of medical data. And interestingly, only 10% of that is really our personal medical record, the information that our doctor would know about us. About 30% of that data is our genetic profile. And 60% of the data that we will generate about ourselves during our lifetime is what we would call exogenous data, which is data about us and the way that we interact with the world around us, and the world around us interacting with us. And so as we think about this world of data that's exploding around us as individuals, we need to look at new ways that we can develop solutions for healthcare management and treatment and wellness treatment. And that's the ecosystem that we've now arrived in as Watson Health, is to look at the different types of solutions that will drive value with a focus on the individual. And we've been building out an ecosystem of partnerships and relationships over the last 2 years to focus on each one of these programs around these curves you see on the chart here. Interestingly, as a technology company, we already had many relationships with hospitals, with pharmaceutical companies, with medical device and diagnostic makers. And we become then the trusted data aggregation platform for many of those partnerships. And so we've been building out what we call our Watson Health Cloud to aggregate all the data that you heard David and Michael talking about, so that then we can develop specific solutions around those data sets. So to give you some examples of the kind of solutions we've been focused on discovery solutions and real-world evidence. And that's really what we'll talk about today as it relates to understanding the data sets for cancer. But around each one of these areas, whether it's for social programs, for support, for health and wellness in partnerships with device makers, as well as the real-world evidence, in each one of these, we have solutions that we're now bringing to market as a technology company in partnership with key institutions. So let's talk about some of these in the context of health. If I could have the next slide, please. So Watson, Sophie mentioned Watson. Some definition of Watson. So Watson is what we call a cognitive system. And what we mean by that is it is a series of capabilities that enable us to infer insights from data. Now, to infer insights from data, you need to understand the language of the data. And most computer systems today are programmable systems. You teach them rules and programs, and you create search capabilities. But in order to be able to access the huge amounts of data that exist within the field of medicine, you have to teach these algorithms the semantics of the language of medicine. And in fact, you want to be able to infer relationships and insights. And that requires you to start developing these systems in really a fundamentally different way, that you want those computer algorithms to learn patterns in the data and to get better at learning patterns in data. And so with Watson, we've developed a set of capabilities that enable us to interact with natural language. And the reason this is so important for medicine is so much of the language of medicine is unstructured data. It doesn't exist in traditional databases. It could be clinician notes. It could be medical images. It could be pathology data. All of the aspects of the information about the medical record for the individual comes in different forms and structure. And the way that we learn the patterns in those data mean that we develop these cognitive systems. And so Watson is aggregating all of these sets of information together and then enabling clinicians to interact with the data in much more of a natural language style of interaction. So you are asking questions and inferring information across the data to enable us to identify those patterns within the data set. So within this Watson system, we have a family of offerings. Sophie mentioned Watson for Oncology. A family of offerings that we're bringing to the marketplace based on real experiments with clinicians. Next slide, please. So here's some examples of where we've started. So starting from 2011 onwards to today, we've embarked on a series of initiatives with leading cancer institutions, starting in the United States, starting with Memorial Sloan Kettering, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and the Mayo Clinic, around Watson for Oncology and some of our offerings around Watson Clinical Trials Management. And we've been focused on really understanding a number of different elements, the genomics of disease and the DNA of a specific cancer tumor. We've been focused on aggregating the data set so that we can, to use Michael and David's words, get to an individualized treatment for an individual mutation around a cancer. With work that we did with the New York Genome Center, we had a focus on glioblastoma as our original starting point. And if you think about any tumor and the amount of data that it generates, 800 billion base pairs of DNA that you need to try to understand if you're looking for mutations within a particular gene responsible for a tumor. In the case of glioblastoma, you may be looking at over 23 million relevant research articles and finding. And over 14 million cancer patients that you want to understand the outcome of particular treatment protocols or survival associated with a particular data set. So think about that. 23 million articles. For those of you who are clinicians in the room trying to keep up with just the PubMed literature, it's almost impossible as an individual to be able to have your fingertips accessing all of the data that's being generated every day. And so that's where some of these compute technologies come in, because we can bring all of that literature data together, interpret it, understand it, and make it searchable in the context of looking for particular treatment protocols that may be relevant for this individual patient with this particular profile and the particular characteristics of the DNA of an individual tumor. So I'm going to give you some examples of what we've been doing with some of these organizations. Also, as you'll see from this list, in the last 2 years, we're actually expanding out beyond the United States into partnerships with other countries and other institutions in different geographies, including here in the broader Asia-Pacific region. Next slide, please. So one of these offerings is Watson for Drug Discovery. And so again, imagine that you're trying to look at new treatments for a particular disease. And you're trying to identify protein interactions. You're trying to look at new treatment options. and you're trying to look at, are there clinical trials that might be relevant for your particular patient that's presenting in a certain different way. So with Watson for Drug Discovery, this offering enables us to aggregate these different data sets together. And one particular example of use with Watson Drug Discovery is a study that we did with the Baylor College of Medicine, looking at p53 phosphorylating kinases. If I can go to the next slide, please. Now, with one of the questions that we got with Watson Health when we first started on this journey of exploring our Watson cognitive systems for medicine was, can we demonstrate that we can actually mine data and drive new insights from those data sets? So a lot of medical literature requires us to demonstrate that these cognitive techniques, we can baseline our techniques around known evidence and then find new insights within those known evidences. So with p53, we were looking for evidence of kinases. We're actually given a test by the Baylor College of Medicine that says, if we give you this body of data before 2003, can your Watson system find what we already know about certain kinases and the relationships between p53 and certain genes? And in essence, that was an opportunity for us to baseline our algorithms' ability to look for new insights in the data. So not only were we able to see these insights from the testbed of literature we were given, but we were also able to identify new relationships and new interactions that give us opportunity for insight of new treatments for the future. And that's really important, that we're able to drive new insights, not just find the things that we already know, but to look for new and different patterns in the data sets. Next slide, please. So with Watson for Genomics, we're really focused here on target identification. In essence, with Watson for Genomics, what we're looking at is building, in essence, a map of mutations for a particular patient. And then we're searching for that proverbial needle in the haystack, where we're looking for, against the body of literature, we're looking for characteristics where we can see examples of other treatments or other clinical trials that have proven valuable for that 2 or 5% specialized group of individuals with a particular set of mutations. So as we think about the world of big data, these techniques now enable us to have the potential for new target identification, discovery of companion diagnoses and treatments, as we were hearing earlier, looking for combinatorial possibilities. And this Watson for Genomics platform is now something that we're finding in use within tumor board discussions at leading cancer institutions. That the Watson offerings here enable the clinicians to sit down and look at alternative treatments in that tumor board discussion and interact with the Watson system and ask questions of our Watson system to look at new opportunities for treatment. Now, going beyond that, one of the partnerships that we've just launched in the United States as part of Vice President Joe Biden's National Cancer Moonshot is a partnership with the US Department of Veterans Affairs, where we're now taking this Watson Genomics platform and creating this open cancer repository to enable the Veterans Administration to help treat veterans and to look at patterns of the data within that population within the Veterans Affairs. And so we announced this a few months ago as part of this open consortium around the work we had started with the New York Genome Center around glioblastoma, now expanding out into a number of different cancers within that population of US-based veterans. Next slide, please. Whoops, sorry, can you go back one? So let's come to Watson for Oncology, which is where we started here. We're really focused here on the individual patient. and looking for guidelines that are relevant for this individual patient and selecting potentially new clinical trials that might be relevant for this particular patient. So we've built these systems for this interaction style very much around bringing all of the information to bear. Now, most of what I've talked about so far is really textual data. It's information that we are translating into a text-style format so that we can then do analysis against the data sets. So in the case of Memorial Sloan Kettering, as the experts in the disease and the cancer, have been helping us to train Watson with the language of medicine by bringing in all of the amounts of publication data, literature. And with Watson for Oncology, our initial focus from a disease perspective was around breast, lung, and colorectal cancers. And as we work with new institutions around the world, we're expanding that work to extend into, for example, stomach cancer and oral cancer with some of the relationships we've engaged in. So since the initial starting work with Memorial Sloan Kettering, we're now leveraging this work with medical practitioners in Manipal hospitals in India, where they're actually using Watson for Oncology as part of a medical student teaching aid to help the students learn about the practice of oncology, because now they have access to the data. With Thailand, with Korea, with China, it gives us the opportunity to expand this initial core set of capabilities on a small set of cancers into much more specialized, or as we've been describing here today, rare cancers that enable us to look for similarities from one to the other and to build out this ever-increasing base of information. Now, identifying the cancer is the first step, but clearly the next step is for us to be able to look at clinical trials matching. And so again, as part of this Watson family, we're looking at, can we now bring all the information together and start integrating a set of recommendations around clinical trials that combine all of the information and that enables the tumor board discussions and the physician's dialogue to identify a particular patient's relevance for a clinical trial. Think about the example that Michael was using, that telemedicine, you're not necessarily in the same place as the patient who might be in remote Queensland or Northern Territories. How do you bring that person and the opportunity for treatment of that person close to the physician? And by aggregating these data sets, we can then make recommendations for clinical trials for a specific individual. Next slide, please. And so we're really looking here at the eligibility of a patient, site selection for the patient, connecting the physician to the cognitive assistant that is accessing this huge amount of data within our Watson Health Cloud. And then we can look at progression of the disease as we continue to aggregate in all of the data here. It enables the clinician-patient dynamic to change because of access to the data set. Next slide, please. Now, I want to bring this back to Australia and what we're doing here locally. So Sophie, when she introduced me, described me as the lab director for IBM Research Australia. Within our research labs, we have 12 labs worldwide, and our lab here in Australia opened 5 years ago now, back in 2011. And a big focus of the research that we do here in Australia is in the broader field of health and life sciences. And it's around driving this convergence of health and life sciences, leveraging some of these computer science techniques, cognitive systems, to drive new insights. And as part of that broader network of research labs, we're driving new insights around how to interpret data that then build out into our cognitive platform for our Watson systems. So to pick on a couple of examples, one not specifically related to cancer, but it's very important in the context of building algorithms that can interpret patterns in data, is actually the field of neuroscience. If we're going to build technologies and algorithms that can interpret data and see patterns in data, then probably the best pattern recognition engine that exists today is the human brain. So the more that we can understand the function and structure of the human brain as an information engine, information in, information out, and the way that the synaptic impulses fire in the brain to transfer information, the more we understand about the way the brain sees patterns in data, particularly visual data, the more we can design algorithms for the future that look for patterns in the same way that the human brain is so good at looking for patterns. So within Australia, one of the key focus areas for our lab in Melbourne is around medical imaging and medical imaging analytics. Most of what I've described for Watson Oncology so far has been around literature data, patient record data, clinician notes, the electronic medical record. But such a huge amount of our medical data is image-based. We saw PET scans earlier today. We've been developing a series of analytics around medical imaging, but with a particular focus around melanoma. Again, looking at opportunities here for us truly to advance the state of the art of knowledge and understanding, but also to look at real opportunities for early identification and detection of melanoma that will then lead to some of the prognoses and treatment opportunities that we saw earlier. So I can go to the next slide. Thank you. So with melanoma, but you can extend this into other examples of cancer analytics as well, we've really been focused here in building some partnerships with some of the key Australian institutions around melanoma to look at how can we train our medical imaging analytics to be able to identify and recognize different styles of skin disease, to be able to determine and differentiate between the difference of melanoma versus squamous or basal cell carcinomas. And so we're looking here at partnerships that we have with the Melanoma Institute in Sydney, as well as a partnership that we have with MolMap for Australia and New Zealand to build a library of images of skin disease. And then we're teaching our Watson assistants, our cognitive algorithms, to be able to identify features in an image that would enable the dermatologist or the clinician to be able to do early diagnosis and identification of melanoma based on a medical image. Now, it's quite hard for computers to interpret medical images. There are all kinds of features in an image that are not relevant to what you're searching for. And so we've been looking at developing these algorithms around some of the mnemonics that a trained melanoma or oncologist would be looking for. And a dermatologist typically uses the mnemonic ABCD for asymmetry within the lesion, border detection, color, dermatology, and in fact sometimes E for the episodic evolution of disease. And so we're developing these algorithms to be able to look at color, asymmetry, border detection, so that you can scan through thousands and thousands of medical images and present the most significant medical images to the trained dermatologist, or in some cases suggest a referral based on this vast amount of medical data. So it's not as straightforward as saying, is this cancerous or not? You want to be able to do differential diagnoses on what type of disease that you're seeing in a dermatology image or a clinical photograph. So we've been really focused on this detection and identification of disease, leveraging computer science to build out our knowledge in this vastly expanding sea of data. So big data, it's expanding. It requires new insights and new techniques, new cognitive systems to drive insights into the data. And with respect to cancer, one of the areas that we've started on here with our new lab in Australia is with melanoma. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention and look forward to the conversations today.